They used the word as if it were her name, fertile. It followed her through the dust of Dry Creek, clung to her skirts, crept into the saloon whispers and the churchyard glances. Men spoke it with a half-smile, women with a tightening of the mouth, and elders with the certainty of those who believed they understood the order of the world. In a land where children were a promise against loneliness and loss, the word should have been a blessing. Instead, it became a wall around her, high and invisible, built from fear and expectation. Her real name was Eliza Moore, and she lived in a narrow house at the edge of town where the prairie began to breathe. Eliza had arrived in Dry Creek as a bride years earlier, young and hopeful, with hands that already knew how to coax life from stubborn soil. Her husband, Thomas Moore, had been a farmer with a laugh that carried across fields and a plan for orchards that never quite made it. Past the first winter, he died beneath a falling beam while repairing a barn after a storm, leaving Eliza with land half cleared and a town that did not know what to do with a widow who still looked like spring. When a doctor, old and careless with words, remarked that she was a strong, fertile woman, the phrase took on a life of its own. Suitors came with assumptions rather than affection, with demands rather than patience. One by one, they drifted away when Eliza refused to be reduced to a function. Dry Creek was not cruel in the way of knives. It was cruel in the way of weather, slow and wearing. Eliza worked her land, sold vegetables and preserves, and learned to hold her head steady beneath the looks. Nights were the hardest, when the prairie wind spoke of distance and the stars, pressed down with their vast indifference. She had friends enough, but companionship was something else, something that seemed always to slip through her fingers like creek water. The day Jack Calder rode into town, the heat lay thick as honey. He came in with a small herd, dust-caked and quiet, a man shaped by long days and longer silences. He tied his horse outside the general store and stood for a moment, scanning the street as if measuring it. People noticed him not because he was handsome, though he was in a lean, unpolished way, but because he did not look at them as though he needed anything. He was there to sell cattle, buy supplies, and move on. That was the story he carried in his shoulders. Eliza met him by accident at the well. She was drawing water, sleeves rolled. When he waited without comment, had tipped back just enough to show eyes the color of storm clouds clearing. He offered to lift the bucket when he saw her strain, and she accepted without reading anything into it. Their talk was simple: weather, water levels, the price of grain. When he thanked her and moved away, there was no lingering. It was the absence of expectation that made her watch him go. They crossed paths again at the market, then at church, where Jack sat at the back and listened as if the words mattered. He did not ask questions that reached too far, did not mention the word everyone else carried like a badge. When he learned her name, he used it carefully as if testing its weight. Eliza found herself speaking more than she intended, not because he drew it out of her, but because he left space for it. Dry Creek noticed, as it always did. Whispers began to bend in a new direction. A cowboy passing through was a safer hope than a farmer who would stay and judge. Eliza heard it all and said nothing. She had learned that silence was sometimes a fence you could move. Jack stayed longer than he planned. A broken wheel, a sick horse. The simple truth that the land tugged at him in ways he had not expected. He took work mending fences, moving stock, and spent evenings at the edge of town, watching the light fade. Eliza invited him to supper once, then again. He ate with gratitude, spoke little, listened much. When he laughed, it surprised them both. They walked together along the creek, boots scuffing stones, sharing stories that did not demand answers. Jack spoke of places he had seen, of storms that taught him respect, of losses he named without drama. Eliza spoke of Thomas, of the orchard she still hoped to plant, of the ache of being seen only for what people thought she could produce. Jack listened, jaw set, and when she finished, he said simply, "That's not all you are." It was not poetry, but it was truth offered without condition. The town waited for something to happen, as if stories were owed a shape they recognized. What happened instead was quieter. Jack helped Eliza clear a new field. They worked side by side, sweat and dirt and shared labor, doing what words could not. When storms came, they took shelter together, speaking of nothing urgent. When the harvest was good, they shared it without ceremony. Trust grew like grass after rain, unremarkable, until you noticed it was everywhere. There were moments of doubt. Eliza woke some nights with the old fear that she was building hope on sand. Jack stood at the threshold of leaving more than once. The road calling with its familiar promise of movement without consequence. Each time he stayed, not because he was trapped, but because he chose to be. Choice, Eliza learned, was the truest form of commitment. The word did not disappear from Dry Creek, but it lost its edge. People saw Eliza laughing, saw Jack repairing her roof, saw two lives aligning not through urgency, but through care. When someone spoke carelessly, Jack's steady gaze was enough to quiet them. He never made speeches. He simply behaved as if respect were the only language worth learning. Winter came early that year, hard and bright. Jack fell ill after a long ride in sleet, and Eliza nursed him through fever with the same calm diligence she gave her fields. In the closeness of those days, something settled between them, not rushed or dramatic but firm. When Jack recovered, he took her hands and said he had nowhere else he wanted to be. Eliza believed him because he did not. Frame it as a rescue or a promise to fix what was not broken. He framed it as partnership. They married in the spring, under a sky rinsed clean. The town attended, curious and softened. Eliza wore a simple dress, and Jack's hands trembled when he placed the ring. Life did not become easier in the way stories sometimes lie about. Crops failed and succeeded. Money was tight and then less so. Arguments came and were worked through. What changed was the center of things. Eliza was no longer a rumor or a label. She was a woman building a life with a man who saw her whole. Years later, when children did or did not come, Dry Creek learned a different lesson. Some things were not owed explanations. Fertility, it turned out, had many meanings. It was the orchard that finally took, the laughter that returned to a house once quiet, the way two people could make room for each other in a hard land. Jack had not proved anything the town could tally. He had simply done what no one else had managed. He had loved without reducing, stayed without claiming, and in doing so changed the story. When the prairie wind moved through their fields, it carried seeds farther than anyone could see, and Eliza, standing with Jack at her side, knew that whatever grew would be enough.